This is a Rattle and Hum Sports Podcast for Sunday, November the 3rd. I'm Bryan Houston. Thanks very much for joining us. The Dallas Cowboys come from behind in the closing seconds to defeat the 1-6 Minnesota Vikings, who are now 1-7. And with us to break it all down, Matthew Postins covering the Cowboys for Rattle and Hum Sports. Matthew, what do you make of this ball game today?
I make that it was sloppy and that it was not at all well played by the Cowboys, but they got the win, and that's the important thing. You're going to have a game or two like that every year, and this falls into that category. It's sloppy, but you got what you wanted out of it.
The first thing that comes to mind in this ball game is the ridiculous lack of numbers of attempts rushing by the Cowboys. Did they end up ever running the ball more than 10 times in the game?
No, they got 9 carries in this ball game against 51 passes from Tony Romo, and I find that just completely and utterly deplorable. Honestly, I think Bill Callahan should have to answer some questions as to why they threw the ball so much today against the Vikings. And I know the Vikings secondary was beat up. I mean, that was pretty obvious coming into this game, and they got beat up more as the game went on. But it was just a complete juxtaposition, because you saw how the Vikings ran the football with Adrian Peterson, and you saw how they committed to it, and then you saw in the fourth quarter how Peterson just ran over the Cowboys. And conversely, the Cowboys just stopped running the football in the second half of the game, and then they would try to run play action for some inexplicable reason, like the Vikings were actually going to fall for that. It was just absurd at times. Just they completely forgot about the run game. And when you get DeMarco Murray back from injury, and you say he's basically 100%, you say he could have played last week, and you don't use him, you just kind of scratch your head and think to yourself, why in the world did you even activate him if you're not going to use him?
The other thing about this is the Minnesota gave up 180-something yards rushing last week. Mm-hmm. So, it's not like they were a team that was going to be able to dominate and stop a running game. The Cowboys just didn't even try.
No, they didn't, and we've talked about this before, how this Cowboys team seems to have a lack of commitment to the run game. Well, it really showed up today. I mean, it wasn't like they fell behind by 2 touchdowns and had to start throwing the football. They were never behind by more than 3 or 4 points in this game throughout, and they just turned their back on the run game, and I really don't understand why. Perhaps part of it is the fact that Brian Waters is no longer up front. Perhaps they felt they could run the football better with Waters at right guard than Mackenzie Bernardo, and if that's the case, well, then that's a bigger problem, because then you don't have confidence in your offensive line to run the football, to open up holes for your running game, and then that puts you right back where you were last year, where you couldn't run the football, and you had to have Tony Romo throw the ball 40 or 50 times to win the football game, and then your protection broke down as the game went on. And that's what happened today, and if that's what's going on right now, then you're right back where you were last year.
The other thing that stands out to me, there are a lot of things to get to, but right off the top, and I texted you when this came down, when Romo threw the touchdown pass to Dwayne Harris to take the lead with 35 seconds to go, I sat there and started trying to rack my brain. I could not remember if Tony Romo had ever won a ball game inside a minute to go in the ball game, coming from behind, leading his team to a win, kind of a Staubach-type comeback. And you were able to find some numbers, but we may have seen a first today.
Yeah, this looks like it was the first time that Romo led them to a last-minute victory when they took the football over in the last minute. They beat the Browns last year when they were down 20-17 and got the football back with 1 minute and 7 seconds to go, and ended up winning that game 23-20. I think this was the first time that I'm going to have to look at the play-by-play to be sure. This might have been the first time that the Cowboys got the ball inside of 1 minute and won the game that way. I'd have to look around to that to be sure, but actually that's not the case. They picked up the ball with 2:44 left to play, so this is the second time that they've scored a touchdown inside of 1 minute to win a game in a comeback. And by the way, it's Romo's 19th come-from-behind victory of his career.
Wow. And he had 5 comebacks in 2012 for a franchise record, but again, no last-second wins like today. That's what I'm talking about. Is
Yeah.
coming from behind in the fourth quarter is one thing, but coming from behind when you got a minute to go and you got to drive 80 yards, that's a whole different animal there.
Yeah, Cleveland's the closest they got to that last year when they took over with a minute 7 left. So it's kind of a similar comeback from last year to this year. But Tony got them down the field. He got one big play out of Dez, who had been relatively quiet in the second half, and that seemed to get them going in those final seconds when they were able to get the ball to Harris, get it across the goal line. And, of course, the missed extra point by Minnesota became a huge factor in that because with Bailey's extra point, that put them up 4 instead of 3, where if Walsh had made his extra point on the previous Vikings touchdown, they would have been up 4. Then the Cowboys scored. They would have only been down 3. That would have been a game-tying field goal. It's just a lot of little things in the last few minutes of that game added up to something more dramatic than I think a lot of us expected.
Well, there's no question about that. The other play, I thought Tony Romo was brilliant when he tried to kick the ball forward and get a first down.
Yeah, nice foot wedge. Didn't quite work, but a nice foot wedge. That works a lot better in golf when you don't have tons of cameras on you and tons of people around you.
Did like that. The first half of this ball game was a nightmare. I mean, it was about I could just see thousands of people asking for their money back in that first half. It just too. Well, you knew Minnesota was dreadful, but Dallas played down to it. They looked like they were the 1-6 team playing in the first half.
They did. They were not sharp. Of course, they didn't really run the football, even though DeMarco Murray did have a 27-yard gain on that first drive. Romo, there seemed to be some carryover from last week because Romo was not throwing, it right in the wheelhouse of receivers. The defense was having a little difficulty getting to Christian Ponder. That kind of changed as the game went on, especially in the second half. But no, they were not sharp overall in the first half of this game, and they were lucky, really that they were only down 10-6 at the half because Minnesota, maybe if a better quarterback had been behind center than Christian Ponder, who did have a pretty good day, maybe they could have had a 2-score lead going into halftime as opposed to a 4-point lead.
Yeah, and in the first half, Christian Ponder was the reason that the Vikings were up 10-6.
He did, and he had protection, and that was the big thing between the first half and the second half. He had good protection in the first half, and then the Cowboys made adjustments. They moved some guys around in the defensive line. They got a tremendous effort out of Everett Brown, who hadn't played a game in 2 years. And in the second half, they started getting pressure on the quarterback, and that was really cemented by that sack that turned into a touchdown in the end zone right after the Cowboys took the lead to start the second half.
The Cowboys in the second half, you mentioned it, they showed some fire, 2 straight 26-yard passes from Romo to Witten, who had been almost non-existent last week against the Lions, and they get the touchdown. And then right after that, the defense comes through with Selby knocking the ball out of Ponder's hands in the end zone and Nick Hayden falling on it for a touchdown. And just like that, within, 50 seconds, you got a 20-10 lead. But it seems like this team just does not have a killer instinct. When they have a big lead, they had a big lead like this last week against Detroit. I say 10 points or more, and just can't seem to put a team away.
Yeah, it's the adjustment they made offensively in the second half. The big adjustment was getting the football to Witten in the middle of the field. The Vikings really had no answer for that, and that sack and touchdown right after that, 2 scores within 10 seconds of each other. It seemed to really spark that defense for the rest of the half. I mean, they still made some mistakes. They still gave up some yards, but they were floating around Christian Ponder the rest of the football game after that. But, again, they're up by a touchdown. They've got control of the game. They would seem to have the Vikings right back where they want them, and the Vikings come right back down the field after the Hayden touchdown and get a long touchdown pass to Kyle Rudolph to make it a tight football game again. So, sometimes this is one of those games where, it was very back and forth there early, and you get momentum and you give it back so fast you never really knew you had it before you realized it was gone.
Well, and we also see then in the fourth quarter where the Vikings start to take control of the football game, And what we've talked about before, and you mentioned it earlier, commitment to the run. You may not get a ton of yards early in the ball game, but then eventually Adrian Peterson will wear you down, and that's when he busted loose for a 52-yard run.
Yeah, exactly, and that's really what the Vikings do best, is they commit to the run. They get the ball in Adrian Peterson's hands a bunch, and they just wear a team down. That's what the Cowboys did to teams in the 90s with Emmitt Smith. Emmitt Smith really wouldn't break a lot of big runs at the beginning of the game, but when you get into the fourth quarter, if you run the football 20 to 25 times, you've really done a number on the defense, and that's going to open up holes. And that was the whole thing with that long run and then the long touchdown run that Peterson had. That Cowboys front four, from a run-stopping standpoint, was worn out. I mean, those were Peterson's, I think, 24th and 25th carries of the game at that particular point. So, yeah, you've got some fatigue that sets in. You've got guys that try to overcompensate when they know they don't have the energy, and those kinds of runs happen. The Cowboys just don't have that in their quiver right now, and which is strange, because when you hand DeMarco Murray the football 20 or more times, you win. You're 10-0, and how the Cowboys don't get that correlation, I don't understand.
I don't either, but when you look at it, the bottom line is the Cowboys were able to come from behind. One of the things that was a big topic of conversation all week long was the quote-unquote passion of Dez Bryant, which I thought almost got them beaten today when he pulled his helmet off after he was called for offensive pass interference. Is this guy ever going to learn?
I don't know. You cannot stack immaturity on top of a penalty like that, and that's what that was. That was just pure immaturity. That was Dez Bryant losing his head, forgetting about the rules, knowing you can't take your helmet off. He knows that. Every NFL player knows you can't take your helmet off on the field. So that was just pure immaturity right there, and a case where you let your emotions get the better of you. And that probably is happening too often, in my opinion, when it comes to Bryant. Now, you're never going to turn this guy into an emotionless player. I mean, that's never going to happen. You're never going to have an NFL player who's going to play emotionless. But you've got to keep your head in those situations. And given the day that he had between that and the drops that he had before the long reception on the final scoring drive, he didn't have a very good day. The Vikings seemed to do a pretty good job bracketing coverage, and he made some mistakes himself that really hurt him until he redeemed himself a little bit with that last reception. But he's still got some maturing to do. As much progress as he's made over the last year and a half, he still has some maturing to do.
The offensive line for the Cowboys started to take on water today. They looked a little bit more like they did last year, where they had a real hard time protecting Romo, and he had to do an awful lot of running around and improvising, making plays with his feet. Is that something is that a trend? Is that something we're going to start seeing now because Bernado's back in the lineup?
Well, I'll be interested to see if we see that again next week, because unfortunately, and you hate to pin it on one guy, but unfortunately, he's the new denominator in this formula. The Cowboys were doing a very good job of protecting Romo with Waters at right guard. With his injury, Bernardo slips into the starting lineup, and they do a average job protecting Romo today, and at times below average. Now, I think having a consistent running game would certainly help in that regard. Running play action when you've only run the football 5 times in 3 quarters is a bit baffling to me, to be honest with you. But this offensive line plays more like the offensive line of last year, certainly. And if it's going to continue in this fashion moving forward, the Cowboys have to identify a right guard of the future, because Mac Bernardo, as well liked as he is, just doesn't seem to be getting the job done. Doug Free did not have a particularly good day today either, but in comparison, Free was better than Bernardo.
All right, and then we look at the total offense in this thing. The Cowboys once again give up a lot of yards, 393 yards to a team that's just not a very good offensive team, especially throwing the football. But Ponder had 236 yards passing today. But again, they make up for it by their forcing of turnovers. It's an amazing thing that they can do what they do. And we've seen bad defenses get into Super Bowls because they can create turnovers. The Patriots were a team that did that a few years back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, turnovers make all the difference if you can create them, and that's the one clear difference between this team and last year's team. The Cowboys now have 22 turnovers in 9 games. I believe that's 6 better than their first 9 games a year ago. So you can already see the difference that Monty Kiffin's had in terms of just changing the mentality on this football team in terms of creating turnovers. Now, the yardage and the passing yardage especially, those are situations that still need to be worked out. And, frankly, he may not get those worked out this year because as banged up as this team is, Jason Hatcher has a strained neck. Nick Hayden suffered a minor injury today. I mean, they still continue to have attrition up front on the defensive line to the point where it's almost absurd. So he may not be able to fix all the problems this year, but if they can continue to carry this mentality of creating turnovers the rest of the season, then they can stay in most football games.
Well, they did do that today. As far as the defense was concerned, Scandrick made an interception today. Thought he played a really good ball game in the secondary.
Yeah, it wasn't just the interception. He had a couple pass breakups too. He was around receivers all day. He was in position to make plays. I think he had one penalty. I didn't necessarily agree that it was a penalty. It was a holding call on Jennings. I really didn't think he held at all on that play, but he got called for it. But overall, I think he had a very good day in the secondary, and he made up a little bit for the fact that B.W. Webb had some issues in coverage. Webb had kind of a hot and cold day. He had a couple of really nice plays, and then he had a couple of really bad plays. But Scandrick and Carr certainly had good days on the corners today for the Cowboys.
Now, let's talk about the significance of this win from a division standpoint. The Redskins win in overtime today against the Chargers, so it's starting to look like things are going to tighten up a bit in the NFC East.
Yeah, it's not going to be one of those situations where anybody's going to have more than a game or two lead this season. I think the Cowboys have pretty much squandered that opportunity at this point. They had chances in the first half of the season to build a 2 or even a 3-game lead over the rest of the field. I think what you're going to start seeing is the Redskins begin to solve their issues. They found a way to run the football today in a big way, and I think that's going to benefit them greatly as they get into November and December. I think the Eagles may be the team that has the most trouble heading down the stretch because they can't seem to get their quarterback situation straightened out between Vic and Foles and Barkley. The Giants are always going to be pesky, and if they ever get their offensive line situation figured out, they'll give some teams some problems. So I don't think this is going to be a situation where the Cowboys are ever going to have more than a game lead the rest of the season. They could still win the division, but again, it's going to come down to those last couple of games to end the season, and guess who they play? The Redskins and the Eagles.
And next week they play the New Orleans Saints, who lost at the Jets today. But again, having seen what good quarterbacks can do to the Cowboys secondary, and Drew Brees plays really well in the Superdome, which is where that ball game is going to take place. He had 382 yards passing against the Jets today. It's a scary thing to think about him against the Cowboys secondary.
Yeah, you know what? And that was against a good Jets defense that had basically taken away the run from the Saints. So basically, it was the Drew Brees show today, and he threw for 382 yards. Yeah, it's not. It has the potential to not be pretty in New Orleans on Sunday night. But you know what? The Cowboys seem to play up to these kinds of teams when they get the opportunity. So who knows what Cowboys team will show up on Sunday night? But I'm betting that it'll end up being a Saints loss. Or Saints victory, rather. Yeah.
I'm guessing that the Saints will be double figures favorites in the game. I'd be surprised if not. The one other person that we really didn't talk a great deal about today, but Jason Witten looked like a Hall of Famer today.
He did. He played very well. And again, it was the adjustment they made in the second half. They obviously figured out that the Vikings were leaving the middle of the field relatively undefended. And the Cowboys really didn't grasp that in the first half. They kept working the outside. And once they made that adjustment in the second half and started getting the ball to Witten up the middle of the field, you saw what Jason Witten can do. Guys were bouncing off of him. He was getting 10, 15 yards in a chunk, got a touchdown catch. I believe he tied Drew Pearson for 5th all-time in receiving touchdowns in Cowboys history today. So just another solid day by Jason Witten, who will likely be in the Hall of Fame one day. You hope he goes into the Hall of Fame with a Super Bowl ring at some point, but you wonder if some folks are just coming to the realization that it may not be in Dallas.
Very good. I will say, again, it's one of those games where they stole it, but it could have been the worst loss of the season, and that's saying a lot, and they managed to avoid that, the Cowboys did today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if they had lost this game, I think we'd be talking more about if this team even has a prayer of winning the division, rather than talking about them being in it till the very end.
I honestly believe we might have been talking about Jason Garrett's future.
Well, it's certainly possible that we could be talking about his future down the line. I don't think this is the season that Jerry Jones had in mind when he made things quote-unquote uncomfortable at Valley Ranch. Again, they're in it. They're in the race in the NFC East, but I don't think this was the kind of up-and-down roller coaster season that Jones was looking for yet again. It was interesting. Jones was in the box the entire game today. He did not come down to the field. But with about 4 minutes to play after Romo threw that interception, he sure looked like he wanted to come down to the field.
Yeah, that would have made all the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it would have.
Okay. All right, what's coming up this week on Rattle and Hum Sports?
Well, we'll wrap up the Vikings game with our First and 10 feature and keep you up to date with everything going on with the Cowboys and Saints leading up to the Sunday night game in New Orleans. And then the bye week. The Cowboys finally get their bye after the Saints game, and boy, do they need a couple weeks off.
Yeah, we do too.
Yeah.
All right. Matthew Postins, thanks very much as always.
All right, thanks, Brian.
Matthew Postins covering the Cowboys for Rattle and Hum Sports. I'm Bryan Houston. This is a Rattle and Hum Sports podcast. We'll talk to you in the middle of the week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.